Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn how to actually make sense of what we're looking at in Lens Studio. Let's get started. Hey there everyone. Today we're going to continue on in our second episode of the Maker series through the continuation of the Snapchat Lens Studio lessons. Again, the purpose of this series is to utilize what we learn in programming and apply it to skills that are a bit more creative and a bit more fun to play around with. Though we won't get to any programming today, we'll continue on learning about how to utilize Lens Studio so that we can eventually get to utilizing our programming skills to make really creative and fun lenses. But for today, we'll focus on making sense of what we're actually looking at when we're on Lens Studio, what it means to mess with our scene, what the objects actually are, and how we should actually play around with them, as well as looking at the inspector panel and the properties that we can manipulate within an object. Today, our primary focus will be on the two panels that I just described, the objects and the inspector. With a better understanding of this, as well as how to manage our resources, we'll be able to begin projects in order to start managing all the things we can do with Lens Studio. And then from there, we'll introduce our code. So to get started, let me go ahead and introduce the setup for today. So for today, we're actually going to go ahead and continue with the same setup, or the default setup that we ran with in the previous episode. So to begin, I'll go ahead and go to this static object that we see on the home page of the Lens Studio. Now, once this project's loaded, what we'll be introduced to is the basic layout of Lens Studio and how Lens Studio will expect and or at least create an expectation for what would be easiest for the user to use in the context of managing assets and everything that's within your scene. So last time we went over what each of these panels meant, but today we'll be again touching on specifically what's going on within this panel and this panel. And they actually are inexplicably linked, or just straightforward, they're linked together. And the reason being is one is used for navigating, selecting, and creating a hierarchy. It allows for you to manage and keep track of where everything is in the same way that you would keep track of layers in Photoshop and or Illustrator. This way you have a nice hierarchy to maybe select a specific item within your scene instead of having to dig around and or potentially select something that is temporarily hidden within the scene. So as you can see here, one of the first things at the top is the camera. When it comes to the camera, it really is the top defining factor of the scene. Almost always, especially within Lens Studio, you'll always have a camera. The camera is pretty straightforward idea. If I were to pull up a phone, the Snapchat lens works through whatever my phone's camera is interpreting. So in order to simulate that within Lens Studio, we have a camera object in order to recreate what our user would either potentially be doing or essentially recreating a scene inside of a digital space. So like that, we can go ahead and see as we move around that our camera is set at a specific height. And if we really wanted to do the math, we could set our camera up to specifically be higher to maybe make a lens that works for people of specific heights. Odd thought. Or maybe we can use the origin point of the camera and create a filter based on the distance that is moved on a y-axis as well. Now, past that, past the ideas for different lenses, we'll move on into lighting. Lighting in a scene will essentially create its primary purpose is to create lighting for the 3D objects or the 2D objects that we have within a scene. This allows for us to go ahead and maybe create a more realistic lighting if that's what we're aiming for with our app. Alongside that, we can also just accommodate and or adjust textures based on the lighting that's available. Through Lens Studio and something like AR, you'll always actually have to consider light because if someone were to place a filter on in a dark room and your vocal points for something relating to the eyes or a hand motion wouldn't necessarily react in the same way as it wouldn't react in the same way in low light as it would in a normal light setting. So with that, we have the idea of lighting. Continuing with that idea of lighting is the idea of a direct point light. As you can see here on our model, we have these areas where the light shines a lot more directly, and that's because of the position of these direct point lights that we have within the scene. So these are under what are called world object controllers, under what we have as a script, essentially. So a script is where we'll be able to introduce our code into this scene. With a script, we can manipulate different objects in the scene. With the script, we can directly manipulate things like the camera, the lighting, and or start and run animations and or create conditions through just kind of tying in a little script of program directly into the scene without directly having to tie it into a specific object, in some cases, at least. Past that, we have our 3D object. So here we actually see that we have a collection rather than just a single object in order to create this collision box that allows for us to create these conditions and or make a more professional setting for our AR scene. Now, while I've been running through all of these, you may have potentially been seeing on the side that we have all these different properties that we can manipulate with all of these different objects, whether it be the camera, whether it be the lighting, whether it be a mesh, a collision box, or a script. With all of these things, there's always properties that we can edit. So now, in the properties slash inspectors panel, and we'll refer to it correctly as the inspector panel, we find that we can edit more than just a single type of property, while also adding more properties to essentially edit when it comes to these objects. For example, here with the camera, we have the transform, specifically dictating the X, Y, Z axis on both its position, rotation, and its scale. And in this case, scale would allow for us to bigger camera equals whatever it's zooming in on is being smaller and or larger in a way. But we also have things that are specific to device tracking. For example, we have different tracking modes, and we'll go into what those are later and or put them directly into practice when we go directly into the making of filters. Past this, we have the direct camera attributes that we can edit within the inspector. So this includes the layers that I had mentioned earlier and comparing the objects in the inspector to layers in Photoshop. This is primarily a management tool, and you'll find other things like the render order in order to dictate what should load first when we load in our AR app, as well as things like the camera type, the depth mode, just any property you can think of. With getting familiar with the different types of properties for each of the types of objects, whether it be cameras, lighting, or scripts, we can really get some punch out of the pack that we have using this editor. So with that, let's go ahead and transition into what we can do with the resource panel as well. And now, to end off my rambling of these different panels, we have the resource panels. With the resources panel, we have a way to organize assets that we could potentially use over multiple projects within Lens Studio. Here we could organize our textures, our scripts, and really we could organize things in whichever manner we'd like. However, the important part is that we can manage items through different projects. So if I had a series of lenses that I wanted to do for a specific meme, for marketing reasons, for different things to do with a single identity. So let's say I'm working for a milk company and I want to do a cow filter. I'd be able to place a cow head somewhere here within these folders and use it multiple times throughout the project and manipulate that cow head in different ways. So it's just simple management, and it won't show up in your scene in the same way that it would if you organized those assets here within the camera, because our ultimate goal with these is to try and keep these as lightweight and small as possible, just so that we can have people download our lenses without really having to wait very long at all. And really, when it comes down to it, when it comes to building lenses, it's about the creativity, how fun they are, not about how large and extravagant, because sometimes those can get kind of annoying, and on lower end phones we find that they don't work as well. So alongside that, I want to go ahead and touch on how to navigate this program just a little bit better using the mouse if you're not familiar with the mouse and you're on Mac OS, and just to help you navigate around a little better, so that next week when we start with directly building a project, we won't have to worry about running into troubles with navigation and or different file types. So keep it nice and simple, and to end off this video, we have the middle mouse button that lets us drag around and essentially use the panning tool. So if we click down on our middle mouse button, we can move on a 2D axis around where our object is. And now, if we took our imaginations and set a center point somewhere in the distance of where I'm looking. So if I were looking directly at the camera and decided I was looking right here at my fingers, what I'm about to do with my right click is move my head from the same point, but with that we can go ahead and pan around different things. Now if we use both together, we can move in a 3D space and turn our heads. So with that, just some simple movement which will help with the navigation of our project later. And then finally, we just have our select tool, and this works in the same way that it does on a desktop when you're dragging the window around and trying to select the different icons, or just messing around with the box because you're bored. Like that, we can select almost everything in our scene, and we just kind of missed our camera. But really, we've touched on most of the basics, and we'll touch on the subjects as we work on our filters throughout the rest of the series. So hopefully you'll join us next week, where we'll actually get something done, and not that learning what we did today wasn't actually doing something, but we'll get past the setup and get into some action when it comes to creating the Snapchat Lens Studio. So until then, have a nice week.